Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for taking the time to be with us today. Appreciate it. Along with my colleagues, Mr. Pascal and Ms. Chu, I've led an appropriations letter requesting increased funding for the IRS. After years of neglect through decreased appropriations, the IRS has reduced workforce and staff to levels not seen since the 1970s. So the reduction in workforce has had a direct impact on taxpayer services, as folks have talked about. And with the funding provided by the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS can be brought into the 21st century and provide taxpayers with the customer service and transparency they deserve. I'm disheartened that funding for the very agency that's responsible for generating 96% of the funds that support the federal government's operations, including infrastructure and education, has become such a partisan issue. So, Commissioner, I wondered if you could speak to why annual discretionary funding for the IRS is still necessary and how the Inflation Reduction Act funding will supplement it.
I really appreciate the question. We've been saying I have a hard job to do, and one of the hardest jobs is to explain the funding that we need and why it's so important. And our base budget, which is currently at roughly $12 billion, that pays for ongoing operations, answering the phones, processing the returns that are coming in. And as you mentioned, what happened over the last 10 or 15 years is our population grew, filing went up, the economy grew, filings got more complicated, and our staff went down to about 1970s level. And so we really couldn't keep pace. So we have to build back to where we can meet that demand. I gave the analogy earlier of people waiting on the train platform, and if you don't fund our base budget, they wait longer and the platform gets more and more crowded. And what we're trying to put in our budget is here's what it takes to make sure that people aren't waiting too long on the platform and then it doesn't get too crowded. That's what it takes just to run the train schedules. But we need to modernize because right now, the system that we have is outdated. And when taxpayers go to their favorite airline or their favorite local bank, they engage and see a suite of tools on the call center, on the website, on their smartphones that they don't get from the IRS. And why? Because in the funding cuts that we've had over the past 10 or 15 years, we haven't had the ability to modernize. We've just kind of kept everything together, and we know that during COVID, we were no longer to keep it together as well as we could, and the bottom dropped out, and we went to historic low levels of service and historic long wait times. One concern I want to make sure is clear, and especially since it's been raised how important our taxpayer service investments are. Because our base budget has not been increased, in order to keep those trains going this year, we had to use Inflation Reduction Act service money to pay just for base operations. So essentially, we raided modernization dollars so that we could answer the phones. And by doing that, we now have less resources to modernize the phone system. It's the difference of, can the IRS answer the phone? Yes. Can the IRS modernize the phone system to improve the callback option, to produce increase automated options? No, not if we raid to pay for base. And that's why it's important that Congress fund both our base and our modernization, because it's the American people that end up suffering. They're the ones waiting on that train platform for the next train to come that's taking too long and it's getting really crowded. And what we're doing in our budget is explaining what we need to do to keep those trains running and what we need to do to give them an experience commensurate with what they get around the block when they go to their local bank.
And it will just get harder the longer we wait to adjust.
Yes, because it's getting more complicated. When I say 390,000 wealthy filers, that number's from 2019. It's probably a lot higher than that now. We're just catching up with the data.
Yep. I also wonder if you could speak to how the enforcement funding in the Inflation Reduction Act would improve taxpayer compliance and would close the tax gap and what the revenue impacts of that might be.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier, when you think about the train platform, you think about service, but there's also an enforcement component there as well. And our audit rates of our most wealthy filers, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about the 400,000 level. I thought it might be helpful to explain to the American people, let's lift that up. Let's lift it up to individuals that make 10 million or more, partnerships and S-corps that have 10 million or more assets, corporations that have 250 million or more assets. So this is the wealthiest of the US filers, right? That is where we have 2,600 staff today with the right skill set and the right responsibilities to assess those 390,000 filers. And I know it sounds weird for the IRS to say it, but we're overmatched in that moment because we don't have enough people with the right skill sets to assess these filers. And if you're middle income, low income, own a mom and pop, we want to build your trust. We want to improve your service, but I don't know that we can effectively build your trust if we have the capacity to audit you, but don't have the capacity to audit the most wealthy filers because those filings are most complex. I would also share and reiterate my message to those mom and pops. There is no new wave of new audits coming. We are focused on building that capacity for the most wealthy filers. That is the directive from Secretary Yellen, and I'm going to meet it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I yield back to Mr. Chairman.